Welcome to an encore presentation of Built to Trash, Built to Last, creating high-impact screencasts when time is scarce and change is constant. My name is John Oliver. I presented this initially at the Library Orientation Exchange, LOEX conference on May 7th, 2016. And there was enough interest before and after for people who couldn't be in Pittsburgh and also from a few people who couldn't be in the room for whatever reason when I gave the presentation. I thought I would just make it available now. So before I get started with the presentation I gave, people should know that when I gave this presentation in person, I had a handout that looks like that you can access here at this URL, and it looks like this. It is a basically one page of content on one side. It's pretty packed with content, but this is all of the stuff of what I presented. If you walk away having read this, you would get a huge chunk of what I presented, and hopefully when I was in person, I was giving stories and telling anecdotes and giving examples, but a lot of what I talked about and a lot of the takeaways I think are on this piece of content. And then on the second page of that are some additional resources, some ways to extend my presentation and to take advantage of some of the resources that are already out there. So I advise you to take a look at that, go ahead and download that and give it a peek before I get started. So I will be talking about screencasts and I will start very shortly by defining what I mean by that. But I like to think that a big part of what screencasts and digital learning objects and a lot of what online teaching and in-person teaching has to do with is attention. And I think this is probably, I think this is our greatest challenge. This is the thing that I put into the foreground of every bit of planning whenever I'm thinking about teaching or presenting or whether it's teaching online or teaching in person. So I'd like to think that I would love it if our teaching was as simple as holding attention like that animation could hold attention. Obviously, our reality is much different and much more complex. But hopefully, I can provide some strategies for managing attention in online teaching. So about screencasts, I'm not entirely greatly precise with the words that I use when I talk about this stuff. I will try to be, but it's very easy to slip back and forth. But I think you'll see that some of these things are wildly overlapping, if not synonymous at times. The most useful terms, the most frequently used terms are screencast. So screencast is a portmanteau of the word screen capture, maybe the phrase screen capture and broadcast. It's typically showing something on a computer screen and then recording it and then somehow broadcasting it. Digital learning object, or DLO, as I'll sometimes say, is a much more general term, and it could encompass a lot more than just grabbing a screen, but hopefully you'll see that in a moment. And then also some other general terms that I've heard are online teaching, library tutorials, library videos. These are the kinds of phrases that have been around for quite a long time, but they are all kind of related. So an example of a digital learning object that I found useful is this 18-minute video about replacing a fuse in a microwave. My microwave broke recently and I was a little concerned about electrocuting myself on the capacitor, so I wanted to find get a little reassurance and get a little bit of an idea of the guts of a microwave. This clip was 18 minutes, and so it was about 17 and a half minutes too long for me, but after watching parts of it, I was able to, go forward, and I felt like I understood enough about microwaves to try to replace a fuse. There's a bunch of examples here that I'm going to go through quickly, but Colgate has an interesting page here that in the center of the page you can see there are some links. These actually go to text-based teaching, so I would still include that in the digital learning object category. And at the bottom here, they have some links to some interactive tutorials. They essentially click through some lessons and videos and some very interesting things going on there. This is something that is on a web page that at UC Irvine, where students or learners are expected to drag the fields of an item, of a library item, onto the names of those fields. So when I drag the book title over to the to the title, it tells me good job, or when I drag it to the wrong place, it says try again, something like that. So this is a interactive way of learning the components of a bibliographic citation. Another example here, the North Carolina State University Big Picture series is really great. I'll talk a lot about that in the next period of time together. But here is a screenshot from an animation where they're describing the research process, and it's a very well done video. It has animations. It's essentially all animations showing very visually interesting explanations of the research process. Here's another example. These might be the most famous of library videos. They are about 1 minute. They're the Library Minute, and they're typically a blend of promotion and teaching. Sometimes it's a little more promotion, sometimes it's a little more teaching, but I would still include these pretty much always in the digital learning object category. And here's an example of a screencast that I've done where I'm showing how to use the catalog here at my library. So here's another example of what I would call a digital learning object. This is a 7.5 minute clip. It's a best of Diamond Minecart. This is a video game player who's quite famous, quite a lot of followers, and he'll play Minecraft for 5, 10, 20 minutes, and students watch this. I have friends who have kids between the ages of 8 and 18, and these people of this age will sit for hours watching other people play Minecraft, learning from it, being entertained by it all at the same time. And I like to think of this when I think about our students, and when I'm trying to create videos, I try to remember that they're also watching videos like this, where they're just watching people play Minecraft and trying to get something out of that. In the room, I asked people about how much experience they had, and it was actually quite a good crowd of people who had a lot of experience. My experience with screencasts, digital learning objects, it reminds me a lot of the bridges here in Pittsburgh. So I was thinking of screencasts as something that should be done in the highest quality possible. I was thinking of making screencasts that would be as permanent and as high quality as the bridges in Pittsburgh are intended to be. So I was in a master's program, and I had to create a study that explored the dimensions, the design features that make screencasts effective. And so I was thinking of ways to make them as high quality and as great as possible. And then meanwhile, I would go to conferences the exact same time, and I would hear people say, make them disposable. A vendor could change the database any day, and you would want to change your website, and who knows, you want to keep these things as disposable as possible. And I was disappointed for a while. I was thinking, well, I'm marching to an entirely different beat. I'm just barking up the wrong tree entirely. And then at some point, I started to think about the fact that the notions of high quality and being disposable, or being less than perfectly permanent, are not mutually exclusive. We can make very good things that are very high impact, that are very successful, but also not feel like they have to last an eternity. And so this bridge is kind of my notion of a compromise. There's nothing extra to it. There's no real artifice, it has a beauty to it, to be sure, but some of the things that I know I find beautiful about it are actually feeding further into the function of it. The kind of cross-hatched ropes are adding to the safety and to the strength of it. And so there's this idea that if we can define our success not as a permanent thing that lasts forever, but if we define our success as provides some benefit for a reasonable amount of time and is successful in encouraging learning. So that's been my goal here. Even when some additional benefits would be really great. This is the same bridge from a different view. It would be probably better if it were a little bit less scary from above here, but we're going to define success as something relatively narrow. So the approach here today will be what I like to think of as maximum effect for minimal effort. And so this is the three components. These are the three components of what I'm going to talk about: some theory, some practical approaches, and a few shortcuts that I think of as logistical leverage points. And hopefully it'll be clear what I mean about the distinction between practical and logistical here. So a good place to start, this is my kind of preoccupation in everything I do, the notion of 80-20 rules. So 80-20 rules get defined in different ways by different people, but what I mean when I talk about them is the 20 and the 80 don't sum. This is not the same. It's actually two sides of the same equation where we have inputs and outputs. So the 20% of inputs that yield the highest number of outputs, or the highest degree of outputs, would be this 80%. So the idea here is, if you wanted to be 100% fluent in a language, you would have to put in 100% of the work. But if you wanted to be 50% fluent, you could probably get by with a ton less effort than 50% of the work. You could study high use words, you could study grammatical structures that scale and generalize really well. So you can put in a lot less time, you can get outsized benefits from some of the same efforts, and it's always my goal to do this as much as possible, and so this is really the starting point of this presentation, the germ of what I was thinking. This is a posted sign in an office park near my house. It actually does exist. I like to visit it once in a while just to make sure they don't get rid of it. But this is a sign that helps me keep in mind to know my audience. And I think about it a lot, especially when I think about online teaching, and I think about it when I consider teaching library material, library concepts and habits and approaches, and any kind of attempts to make that kind of work fun or entertaining in a kind of student-centered way, like thinking about how they might find something fun or entertaining. And I worry that the things that I would do personally that would try to be fun and entertaining would connect with our students about as well as this sign connects with geese. So I tend to try to focus on good instructional design and pedagogy instead. And that's what I'm hoping I can share right now. So this theory, I hope, will be clear to you, is practical. It is essentially confirms and validates what I think is reasonable and what sounds like it would just make intuitive sense for instructional design. So this is from Richard Mayer. Actually, the citation is in the takeaway that I provided a link for. These are the 9 effects that he and his colleagues found are quite powerful when doing instructional design. And I'm going to focus on just 3 of them. I actually think all 9 of them are relevant to what we do, but these 3 are the ones I'll focus on. Now notice that there are these 3 effects, and that notice also in the right-hand column here that there are a number of tests. These are replicated studies that they did. They essentially would teach how lightning works or teach how a bicycle pump works, and then they would differentiate the presentations so that some of them had animation and narration. Some of them had animation and on-screen text, and you'll see a bit more about that in a moment. But so these tests were repeated, and notice the effect sizes are quite strong. Anything that's positive, of course, is a good effect, and anything over 1 is actually really quite impressive. So we'll talk about those 3 effects to focus on today. This is a version, this is a kind of rendering of Richard Mayer's multimedia learning theory. I want to simplify the model just for this presentation a little bit, just to point out that the easiest way to think of this is that there is verbal or word content and there is pictorial content. Now, pictorial here could be moving pictures or still pictures, but so we have verbal and pictorial content, and those things most individuals have 2 channels of the ears and the eyes. And so it's important to note here that verbal content or words can enter through the ears or the eyes in most individuals. And so with multimedia learning theory, it's focused on balancing the content, the presentation of that content, and which channel it's targeted towards. So a couple of the effects here. So just a quick overview, and then we'll double back and I'll show some examples. The modality effect suggests that narration is a better companion to animation than on-screen text is to animation. So you'll see an example of that in a moment. The multimedia effect suggests that animation and narration is better than just animation alone. Excuse me. The multimedia effect suggests that animation and narration are better than just narration alone. The signaling effect is interesting to me. So this can be take many different forms. We do signaling all the time verbally. We say things like, don't forget to remember this, or the most important thing for you to remember is this. The takeaway, if you take away one thing, you should remember this. We do this all the time. We also do it in texts. We do it in journal articles, have headings that serve as signals for organizing information, for noticing the relationship of information and what the different content has. We have signals all the time. In fact, the signaling effect text on this slide is a signal to tell you exactly what I'm focusing on right now. So we do this a lot. It can also happen visually. So let's say this is an example of a digital learning object that teaches a discovery tool, and then you see in the left margin it points out some important aspects of that interface. Okay, so some examples. So the modality effect, as I said, is narration's better than on-screen text. Most of what you find will be information about things that you can reach out and touch with your hands. Paper books, DVDs, video cassettes, and so forth. But the catalog also has many links to electronic versions, and this is a growing part of the library's collection. What's not in the catalog is just as important as what is in it. In the catalog, you will not find article titles from journals, newspapers, or magazines. All right, so that's the modality effect, and you can see that it has quite a strong effect size and has been fairly well replicated. And essentially all that's involved is attempting to tell a story with narration plus animation rather than showing animation or pictures plus on-screen text. Okay, another effect, as I said, is multimedia effect, where animation and narration are better than narration alone. Here's an example of that.
This is a high-level overview of the Lexis Advance user interface. Lexis Advance transforms the way you conduct research by offering innovative features and functionality in conjunction with industry-leading content. We have been able to develop a legal research platform that meets your needs in an efficient and intuitive manner by listening to your feedback, by updating our search system software, and by using the most current web design technologies. As soon as you log in to Lexis Advance, you are greeted with a simple search box that allows you.
So it's important to note there, I think that one's a pretty obvious example of something that's a bit challenging to watch. It's 43 seconds before the screen even moves, and it's just a voice with no kind of movement or no visual interest. It actually,
Simple
just as a
search
side
box
note, it does
that allows
do
you.
something interesting here at the 43, 45 second mark, where it fades out the background and shows the foreground. This would be a good example of signaling, actually, which I'll talk about in a moment. But overall, the 43 seconds before getting to something noticeable and something interesting is a good example of what we do if we teach online. Keep in mind that this is the very first lesson I learned from people who make screencasts all day long. I was fortunate to work with people who just do this just as their full-time job. And one of the first things they pointed out to me is keep in mind how powerful the human presence in person is, and nonverbal gestures. Just every person has charisma to some extent to draw attention in person, and that is just not present in online teaching. That is something that all you have when you're online is the voice that you whatever audio you put in and whatever visual you put in. And so the in-person connection that we often get and so the in-person connection that we have just isn't there. So keep that in mind, that you should show something while you're saying something. So again, the multimedia effect was really strong. It was replicated at least 5 times, and the effect size was quite good. So signaling can take a few different forms. Here's one example.
To refine your results, choose from the options at the left, including peer-reviewed journals and publication date. Or you can select a source type, such as newspapers, magazines, or journals.
Okay, so I should note that that clip is blurry because of my recording problems, not because of the creators of that video. But you notice that it highlights the place where the eye should go. It's very clear on this screen. Our databases are often very busy, but this is something where I know just where to look. This is the signaling of what it is I should have my attention on. This is a relatively weak effect, but I'd like to, and actually some of the research here it says narrations signaled, which is more of that verbal kind of signaling that I was talking about earlier, where we say this is the thing you should pay attention to. But this research has also been done on visual signaling. So it's not a tremendously powerful effect, but I've chosen to focus on it because I feel like it's the kind of thing where if we're going to enhance our videos, I really want to know how effective. I want to explore some ways to make our visual and verbal enhancements as good as possible and as easily as possible. So here's a little bit different signaling. This is actually the focus of my research. On screen here is three kind of thumbnail versions of a full screen tutorial I did. So imagine each of these full screen size. And what you see here are the three conditions of the study that I did. So in the bottom center is a display of me teaching a library catalog, and there's no call outs. And I should just say that I made it a point to make the screen legible enough, and I made it so that the mouse could be found if someone's paying attention and the display is filling the whole screen. So that's the no call out control condition. Top left you'll actually see it in movement. This is something you can only tell in motion, but the top left is as a zooming, it's a highlighting of the area where the focus should be. And that zooming, that call out happens instantly. The call out being that kind of spotlight. And the spotlight happens, it goes from full screen, zooming quick in, almost imperceptibly fast to where your focus should be. And then the top right condition is the thing that I like to think is most effective, which is a kind of gradual zoom in. I call it a fly in call out or spotlight, where we see the full screen and then we gradually reveal the place to focus on. So let me show you an example of that.
WorldCat and Bar Direct. WorldCat and Bar Direct.
So this is, just to be clear, this is the exact same moment in the exact same tutorial. In fact, it all started with the control one on the bottom, the control condition on the bottom, and then I just differentiated them using the software to add those zooming callouts. So this is the exact same moment in the exact same tutorial, and the only difference is the way that the callouts occur. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how the results came out. And it turned out for me that both of the call out conditions, both the immediate zooming, the immediate spotlight version and the gradual spotlight version were better than having no call outs, but they were not different from each other. So I found that to be an effective and easy enhancement to make to videos. Okay, and so a couple more practical approaches. This is a slightly different tact. So one thing we can do, as I said before, is try to say things visually. And of course, I don't need to tell librarians that it's very easy to find non-commercial images or images for reuse. It's not hard to find images that can be reused. And so, of course, Google and Flickr do this and allow you to filter. So I recommend you look whenever you're trying to say something. Try to say it with a visual as well as narration. Another practical approach is to think about evergreen topics. Think about topics that are not likely to change. I think that is the nature of our profession that we'll always have to do here's where you click when you have to do that thing kind of procedural teaching. But I think there are plenty of things that are conceptual and plenty of things that are not going to be subject to interface changes. And a really great example is North Carolina State University's Big Picture series. And here's just one example from that series.
At some point in your career as a student, you've probably had a teacher tell you to cite your sources while writing a research paper. But what is a citation, and why do we do it? Citation is the practice of identifying the sources you have quoted, paraphrased, or otherwise used in your writing, and it's pretty standard practice in academic writing. Citation serves several purposes. For one, it allows your reader to follow up on and to verify claims that you make in your writing, and it gives you the opportunity to acknowledge the people whose ideas you have used to advance your argument. Essentially, you are recognizing that your research and scholarship builds upon the work and the ideas of many others who came before you. The result is that citation helps readers see the connections between
All right,
books and
so
articles
it's
published
about a
by
2-minute clip,
and CSE.
and it's
Most
give me a
at
moment.
the
I'll
end of
fast
your
forward
paper,
here.
of course,
It's
include
about a 2-minute clip, which is obviously plenty targeted, and I know that I couldn't teach citation any better in 2 minutes than this. And so that's actually my main suggestion here. And you see that they're minimally branded. I did fast forward through a bit, but the extent of the branding, I would say, is the red and white color, which is the school colors for North Carolina State and is not the school colors for my school, but that's not a detail that I would ever get hung up on. And so I'll just show you the very end here. This is the extent of the branding and the extent of the kind of institutional identity that you find in these videos.
online tools to help. If you have any questions about citation as a practice or about a particular citation style, ask a librarian for help.
So that's the whole video, and you notice there we see a visual branding here, but there's no mention of it in the audio track. So what I did when I reused this and repurposed this is I kept the audio track, and I just changed the visual that you see here so that it points to the resources at my college. What makes this possible is the tremendously generous Creative Commons license that North Carolina State has made available, and they allow for reuse and adaptation and everything. And I learned during the LOEX presentation that something I should have known, which is that North Carolina State does have files available that are just not branded. So another way to think about not reinventing the wheel is some procedural teaching that can be done. So I think the most evergreen topics are those conceptual things like peer review and citation and topic formulation. These are the things that I think are not likely to change in any way. And those North Carolina State big picture videos do a fantastic job of teaching them. I don't see the value in redoing that, especially since they've been so generous to share it, and many librarians are generous to share it. But like I said, there are always going to be times when we have to teach procedural things like here's where you click when you do this, and so there are examples out there that are also open for sharing and also minimally branded and perfectly ripe for reuse. So here's an example from Claremont Colleges.
The Boolean operator AND can narrow your search. Let's enter the word food into the search box of this database, Academic Search Premier, to see what resources are available. When we run the search, we get 644,893 results, way too many to deal with. Now let's add the term sustainable agriculture to the search using AND. Notice that AND is often the default operator in databases like this one, and in search engines, including Google. Now when we run the search, we get 1,695 results. Still a lot, but we're on the right track to a manageable number of results.
So you see there that's a really good example of someone's perfectly fine teaching about how to use Boolean in an actual database, and there's minimal branding here. At the very top of the clip, there was the Claremont Colleges mention, and then here in the bottom of this screen here, you can see Claremont Colleges. Those things can be fuzzed out or blocked fairly easily, and again, the Creative Commons license allows for reuse of this, and to me, these kinds of mild edits would be far easier than having to recreate an entire video like this. This image here I enjoy on one level, but I have to say it offends me as both a coffee drinker and as a vegetarian. But I do applaud the ingenuity of using something for a purpose for which it was not intended. If in the using kind of an ingenious approach to solve a problem. And I think there's no reason we can't do the same thing with lots of our teaching. There are plenty of digital learning objects in the world that we might not think of as being relevant to our world, but if we are a little creative and if we keep our minds open to it and stay mindful to these opportunities, we can reuse some really great teaching. So I teach a class about information literacy, about library skills, and every single student at my college has to take it in order to graduate. And so I'm trying to add a module about how some of the contradiction and complication and passion that comes from our emotional reaction to ideas and concepts and events can really feed our research process. And so I found this video clip of Ken Burns talking about how he chooses stories that I think is very applicable. Writing research papers has so much in common with storytelling, and choosing a topic for a research project is a lot like the decision about which story to tell. So let's listen to what documentary filmmaker Ken Burns has to say about how he chooses subjects.
You know, the common stories, 1 + 1 = 2. We get it. But all stories are really, the real genuine stories are about 1 and 1 = 3. That's what I'm interested in. We live in a rational world. We're absolutely certain that 1 and 1 = 2, and it does. But the things that matter most to us, some people call it love, some people call it God, some people call it reason, is that other thing where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's the 3. Oh, great story. They're all everywhere. There are millions of them. Abraham Lincoln wins the Civil War, and then he decides he's got enough time to go to the theater. That's a good story. When Thomas Jefferson said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," he owned 100 human beings and never saw the hypocrisy, never saw the contradiction, and more important, never saw fit in his lifetime to free any one of them. That's a good story.
All right. Some other examples here. This is, sometimes it has to get a little bit creepy here. So maybe one of the most iconic images in film history, at the top there, Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, is obviously well-regarded film. And below it is Vince Vaughn as Norman Bates in Gus Van Sant's Psycho. It's a shot-for-shot, line-by-line remake of a film. I think there are a few people who would argue that the Vince Vaughn, Gus Van Sant version is as successful as the Anthony Perkins, Alfred Hitchcock version, but nonetheless, it's an interesting experiment, and it certainly is a lesson I think we can take from ourselves, for ourselves, that we don't have to reinvent every part of the wheel. We can take you can take a transcript from a video that you hear. Let's say you watch a librarian teach some aspect that you want to teach, and it takes 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, and it's great. Some aspect of it's great. Let's say the whole video is great, or let's say the whole audio is great. There's no reason you can't just reshoot the whole thing with just whatever alterations you see fit, and that could be on the level of taking the whole audio track and then just providing the visuals that are relevant for your institution, or vice versa. And so just try to keep in mind there are opportunities here of tons of great work and tons of inspiration that could take just a lot less work on your part if a big chunk of it is handled for you. Okay, so a few logistical leverage points that I think are very kind of nitty-gritty, but I think for me, they have made huge benefits in the quality of my videos and the speed and cost of having made them. So this here is a image that represents the prep that that kitchens do, the prep that cooks and chefs do, is often referred to as mise en place, which is a phrase that means literally in French, putting in place. But I like to think of it more this way. This is actually more the meaning of it. I know Mario Batali is having a laugh here, but the idea is that when a cook makes all of the prep, all the preparations necessary to cook, it is not just because a kitchen makes a dozen or 100 of the same dish quickly in a given night. It's actually there is a profound effect of turning on your prep brain and then turning on your cook brain. And so this is something that chefs do. They would do this even if they had all the time in the world to prepare your dinner. And so this is my reminder to tell you that storyboarding is important. And so it might seem like it'll be faster to just dive right into making a screencast, that you should just hit record and then go and teach something. And obviously that's a fantastic way to draft and to get started and to think about what it is you would like to say, to think about learning outcomes, and how you might visualize something. But it will save you time. It's my experience that it saves a ton of time actually to take a single sheet of paper and draw a line down the middle and put on one side of that line you put the visuals and on the other side the audio, and give some thought to the images or web pages or however it is that you might show something, and then also the audio that would go along with it. Microphones are really important. I started making screencasts with a microphone like this, a little bit different model, but same style, actually the same brand. And with the videos that I created, the kinds of comments that I got were a little bit disappointing. So I see here the volume's inconsistent, the sound is rough, the sound gets louder and softer. This is a result of using this kind of microphone. These microphones are perfectly great, but they do take skill to use. And it turns out that when I made these, I did not have the skill that was necessary. And I don't necessarily recommend that any of us tries to pick up that skill. So I was able to solve all those problems by using this headset, the one that I'm wearing actually in this video, if you can see it. This headset is affordable. It works. It puts the microphone right next to the mouth. It makes the sound levels even. It seems to me easier to make the sound levels at a good, strong volume. I also have found that it cuts out any kind of white noise like air conditioning and things like that. So this is the kind of thing that just very easily solves some of the sound problems. So when you make videos, I suggest that you start from the top each time. It might seem tempting at about take 5 or 6 or 10 to say, oh, well, I already got it. I've done between take 1 and take 3. I've got the good stuff. I don't have to worry about it. I'll just edit it. My experience is that if you're making a 1, 2, 5, 10-minute presentation, that is all the time you'll really spend, whereas the editing can take weeks. It can take a really long time to edit once you start doing it. And so, of course, there's going to be editing, those call outs and those signals and those things that I was pointing out. I think those are really valuable ways to edit the presentations that you make, but keep in mind that those add up very quickly. And so what I like to do is start with just like a really strong take. And I recommend you start right from the top every time. I want to make sure I mention that closed captioning is so tremendously easy in these tools, these recording tools now, that there really is no excuse to not do it. It is not nearly as hard as learning American Sign Language. The accessibility concern is obviously really important. Convenience of the tools for adding closed captioning shouldn't have ever been an obstacle, but I know when I made my first videos, I did make that excuse, and now I'm embarrassed that I waited as long as I did, and I hope in this moment here to make you feel embarrassed for not adding it if you don't. That it is just so easy. In the case of YouTube, it takes just minutes. It really is, especially if you enunciate into a microphone like this, it picks up really well the words that you say, and so it's just a matter of catching a few missteps by the software. So assessment is something to think about. I shouldn't leave it to the very end, and you certainly should think about assessment at all stages. We all should be thinking about assessment at all stages. But it's here at the end, I'll mention that it can be really helpful to just ask a simple qualitative question like this, an open-ended question. I ask my participants in my study this open-ended question, and I got some really interesting feedback. And the way I handle this now, when I'm not running a study, is I'll just grab 5 students or a handful of my colleagues and a few students. And the same 80-20 rule applies with feedback on this. It's simple usability that lots of folks know about. But if you ask 5 people to test your interface or your learning object, whatever it is, you're going to get a lot of the problems, and a lot of the successes will be revealed. So these 3 comments are, the reason I mention them are that when I made my experiment here, and I had no callouts and zooming callouts and kind of gradual zooming callouts and instant zooming callouts. The zooming gradual callouts were perceived by people as being faster. So these 3 comments only came from the people in the gradual highlighting, gradual zooming group. They perceived the video to be faster, even though all 3 videos were exactly the same pace. And so as a result, I now make my videos, when I think about movement on screen and I think about these zooming actions, I think about how fast they move and the effect, the perceived effect that they have on pace. So this is the kind of thing I never would have discovered if I hadn't asked some open-ended questions. So just to sum up, some theory that really helps, some practical theory, is to guide attention and the sensory experience. When you're thinking about making videos, also take some practical approaches like reusing, reframing, repurposing existing content. And some shortcuts that have helped me a tremendous amount is to set it up before you get started, put on your headset, and always start from the top. And thinking again about the bridges, thinking about how if we define success as the learning, as student learning, and we don't think so much about the permanence, or we don't think so much about the ornament of our videos, if we just focus on designing things that students can learn from, I think we can really make a big bang with our digital learning objects and online teaching. I would really love to hear from folks about the kinds of works that they do. And so if you would post, so there are 2 Padlets here. It's actually on the handout that I gave, as well as here on screen. What I'd love to hear on this page are the things that you have seen that you just adore these videos. You think that these are really good librarians who are teaching really great things. And I'd also like to hear what kinds of things you would create if money were no object. What would you do? What would be you had all the time and money in the world, what would you create? And maybe there's a way that we can figure out more accessible ways to do those, more approachable ways to create those screencasts and digital learning objects. On this page, I would love to hear some of the things that you have found effective. So especially among the people who've made a bunch of videos, what are the lessons you've learned? For example, when I mentioned the headset in the room at LOEX, tons of hands went up, and lots of people seem to be agreeing that this headset in particular is a useful thing. So I would love to hear other kinds of things, other kinds of experiences from you. If you have any comments or questions, I can be reached here. I would love to hear from you. Thank you for your attention.